The house smells like paint. Not fresh paint, the particular smell of paint that has dried into walls and become the smell of the walls themselves, of a place that is finally yours. Theo is asleep in the room at the end of the hall, the one we did in a pale sage green that looked wrong on the swatch and right on the walls, the way right things sometimes need space to prove themselves. Toby is beside me in bed with a book he is not reading. It is a Tuesday in October, and I am thinking about Savannah. Not because I miss it. I want to be precise about that. I think about Savannah the way you think about a scar, not with longing, not with grief, just with a kind of forensic interest in the fact that it happened, that it left a mark, that you are nonetheless standing upright. I have been standing upright for 6 years now. Some of them required more effort than others. Gala was at the Bohemian Hotel on West Bay Street, the kind of charity event where the cause is secondary to the venue and the open bar. Robbie had booked a table for 8 through his firm, something about supporting literacy or arts education. I cannot now remember which. What I remember is the dress, a navy crepe that I had paid too much for, and the way Robbie looked at me across the table when he stood to give a brief, unrequested toast to the evening, and the way that look meant something then. He proposed 3 weeks later, in the apartment, not in a restaurant, which I credited to him. He had a ring I had not chosen, which I should have credited as information. It was beautiful in an impersonal way, the kind of ring selected by a man who Googled what women want and followed the results precisely. I said yes. I called my mother from the bathroom 10 minutes later, sitting on the edge of the tub, and I cried in the way you cry when something you wanted has arrived, and you are not sure, in the actual moment of its arrival, whether it is exactly what you ordered. My mother said, "He's such a good man, Lauren. He's going to do so well." She meant it as comfort. I filed it somewhere. Megan arrived for the engagement dinner 2 weeks later, as she always arrived everywhere, slightly late, in a dress that was one calibration more interesting than mine, trailing the specific energy of someone who has learned that entrance is a tool. She hugged me at the door and said, "I can't believe you're engaged," in a tone that held something I chose not to name. She was 29. She had worked in event planning in Atlanta, then communications in Charleston, then back to Savannah for reasons that were never fully explained. She had a long-term boyfriend she occasionally mentioned with a kind of bored proprietariness, the way you mention a lease you're thinking of letting expire. Robbie shook her hand at the dinner table and then, 14 seconds later, told a story she had told at Christmas. Beat for beat. The same timing, the same pause before the punchline. I watched Megan's face, the small flicker of recognition, the decision not to name it, the smile she gave him instead. I noted it. I did not yet know what I was noting. The perfume was in March. I had leaned across the passenger seat to retrieve a parking receipt from the glove compartment, and it was there, something floral and specific, not mine. I wore fragrance that ran toward citrus. This was tuberose. I know tuberose because my college roommate had worn it every day for 4 years, and I have never been able to smell it since without a low, cold register of something I could not then name. I asked Robbie about it in the car, lightly, the way you ask lightly when you are hopping to be wrong. He said, "Caroline from the office brought her dog in the car last week. That's weird, maybe it's her coat." It was the kind of answer that answered nothing while appearing to answer everything. I cataloged it. I kept cataloging. The earring was in April. Tiny, gold, a small curved bar that sat in the cup holder between the seats. I do not wear gold. I wear silver always, a preference Robbie knew and had respected when selecting my engagement ring. I held the earring in my palm for a long moment, then put it in my coat pocket, then threw away the coat pocket's contents without looking at them again. I told myself it was a friend's. I told myself I was being like my mother, which was the worst thing I could think to say about myself, so I stopped saying it. The lunch was my idea. I had texted, "Bringing you lunch, don't leave the office," a thing I had done maybe 4 times in 2 years, always received with some version of grateful surprise. I had a paper bag from the Vietnamese place near his building, 2 orders of pho, the lids sealed with rubber bands, the bag already damp at the bottom. The elevator smelled of someone's takeout coffee. I remember that. His office door was ajar. I pushed it. They were not doing anything irreversible. That is the precise, bloodless way I have learned to say it. They were kissing. A specific kind of kissing, not rushed, not shocked into, but slow and familiar. The kissing of people who have been doing this long enough that it no longer requires adrenaline. Megan saw me first. She stepped back. She did not say my name. She said, "Lauren," in the tone of someone who has rehearsed for this and found the rehearsal insufficient. Robbie turned around. I put the lunch bag down on his desk. I don't know why. Some motor habit of completion, some refusal to drop a thing I was carrying. Then I walked back to the elevator and pressed G and stood looking at the seam in the metal doors while the elevator descended. And when I reached the parking garage, I sat in my car for 40 minutes without starting the engine. I did not cry in the parking garage. I want to record that accurately. I sat very still and I thought, with a clarity I have not experienced before or since. I knew, and I kept choosing not to. That was the worst part. Not the betrayal, or not only the betrayal, the cost of my own management of the evidence. I called my mother from outside a Walgreens at 9 o'clock that night. I had been driving without destination for 3 hours, had stopped for water, had stood in the parking lot unable to go in. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I had found. There was a silence that lasted long enough for me to understand it. Then my mother said, "Oh, Lauren," and then, "I'll come over." And then, after another pause, she called me this afternoon. I drove home. I sat on the bathroom floor. I ran a shower I did not get into until the water went cold. My parents arrived with a spare key at 11:30. My father stood in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on and said nothing at all, which was the most precise expression of love I have ever received from him. My mother sat on the couch beside me and held my hand with both of hers, and whatever complicit small allowances she had made across the years. Whatever peacekeeping had shaped her into a woman who would receive a phone call from one daughter about something done to the other, none of that was visible in her face that night. She looked destroyed. I returned the ring through the doorman the next morning. I did not write a note. Indianapolis was not a plan. It was a job posting that appeared on a Thursday at 11 p.m. while I was eating crackers over my kitchen sink and trying to decide if I could afford to stay in a city that had rearranged itself around what happened. Regional marketing, manager at a mid-sized manufacturing firm. The salary was 12% higher than my current role. The city had a cost of living that made the number feel almost excessive. I applied at midnight. I called no one. I interviewed by video in February and by phone in March and drove to Indianapolis in April to look at apartments with a real estate agent who was deeply, cheerfully proud of her city in a way that I found, unexpectedly, moving. I took a 2-bedroom on the north side. I packed my Savannah apartment in 11 boxes and 2 suitcases. I left the furniture. The first 3 months in Indianapolis were the most voluntarily solitary of my life. I went to work. I came home. I learned the street grid, which is a rational, legible thing, unlike the serpentine logic of Savannah's squares, and I found that I was grateful for legibility. I cooked. I ran along the canal path until my legs ached. I called my mother on Sundays and my father on Saturdays, and neither of them mentioned Megan, and I did not ask. I was not healing. I want to be clear about that. I was surviving, which is a different activity with different metrics. Healing implies movement toward something. Survival is simply the insistence on continuing. I met Toby at a work event, a client dinner, the kind I usually endured with 1 drink and an early exit. He was a project lead at a firm that had recently joined our account roster. He was quiet in the specific way of people who are listening rather than waiting to speak, which I noticed because I had recently become attuned to the difference. He did not try to impress me. He asked about a piece of research I had mentioned offhand and then actually listened to the answer, which in the context of that particular dinner was nearly alarming. We had coffee twice, then dinner once. Then he drove me home and at the door he said, "I'd like to do this again, if that's all right in a register so different from the language I had been fluent in that I stood in my doorway for a moment after he left and tried to locate what I was feeling. What I was feeling was something small and frightened, and not entirely unpleasant. The panic attack came at a restaurant in September, 8 months in. A noise, a cork pulled from a bottle, of all things, and something in my chest that decided without consulting me to reconstruct the worst version of the previous year. I excused myself to the bathroom and sat on the floor of the stall for 6 minutes, which I know because I watched my phone timer. When I came out, Toby was standing outside the bathroom door. He had brought water. He did not ask me to explain. He said, "Do you want to go? We can go." We went. He drove. We sat in a parking lot of a closed hardware store for 20 minutes, and he put his hand over mine without making it a question, and I cried in the front seat of his car, which was the first time I had cried about any of it in front of another person. 3 days later, a small bunch of flowers appeared on my desk at the office. No note. I found out later he had bribed my assistant. The flowers were nothing special, some combination of grocery store stock and whatever was seasonal, and they asked nothing, which was the point, I think, though he never said so. The promotion to director came in November. I had expected it by May, which I mention only to record that I had correctly evaluated my own work, and the organization had confirmed the evaluation on a delay. Regional accounts followed the next year. 3 new clients, a retained budget that was 22% above target, a presentation to the board that I rehearsed 11 times in my bathroom and delivered once, steadily, without notes. I did not tell anyone except Toby and my mother. My father called to say he was proud in a voice that was nearly inaudible with feeling. Toby proposed at an inn in Brown County, Indiana, in October. The inn was surrounded by vineyards, which is a sentence that would have sounded aspirational once and now was simply the description of a place I had driven to with a man I had chosen. He did it over dinner. No production, no meal, no audience. He put the box on the table and said, "I know this is complicated for you. I know what I'm asking. You don't have to decide tonight." My first instinct was physical, a small contraction somewhere in my sternum, a body memory I could not talk myself out of. He watched me have it without looking away. Then I opened the box. The ring was simple, silver. I said yes. I said yes the way you say yes to something you have examined from all angles and found, despite the examination, still to be true. We had a small wedding in March, 30 people. My parents, his parents, colleagues, a handful of friends who had been retained through the Indianapolis years through deliberate maintenance rather than proximity. No maid of honor. The house was bought in June. We painted it together across 3 weekends, badly and then better, and the smell of paint became the smell of something I had chosen. The account situation I found out by accident. Toby's laptop was open on the kitchen table, and I was not looking, not snooping, just reaching past it for my coffee, and the name was there. Robbie's firm, his company's name, sitting in Toby's inbox in an email thread dated 8 months earlier. I asked him about it that evening. He had won the account in a competitive pitch. It was one of the larger accounts he had been managing. He had recognized the firm name when it came through. He had sat on telling me for 8 months because he was, he said, afraid of what it would do to us, whether it would make the whole thing feel like a scoreboard rather than a life. The argument lasted 3 days, not because he had done anything wrong, because he had made a decision about what I needed without asking me, which was a small version of a large pattern I had decided I was done with. We went to counseling for 4 months. I will say about counseling only this: it is uncomfortable in the specific way of anything that is useful. We are still together. The account is still his. My mother was diagnosed in February. Pancreatic. The oncologist used the word inoperable in the same sentence as the diagnosis, which I have since learned is not standard practice, but was in this case simply true. I flew home 6 times in 4 months. I learned the logistics of dying, the medication schedules, the visiting nurse rotations, the paperwork that accumulates around a person as their life condenses. I was good at the logistics. I am good at logistics. I held this capacity as something useful rather than asking what it said about me. Megan appeared in April, the 3rd of my visits. She was thinner. Her hair was different in a way that looked like effort rather than choice. She moved around our mother's house with a careful quality I had not seen in her before, like someone navigating furniture in the dark. Robbie was not with her. I did not ask. My mother died in June, on a Tuesday morning, with my father holding her hand and me holding his arm and the sound of a neighbor mowing a lawn through the open window, which is the detail I cannot seem to file away anywhere. She was 63. She had been complicit in small ways and genuinely loving in large ones, and she had kept the peace for so long that the peace had become a kind of slow suffocation. And I think she knew that, and I think she was tired of knowing it. I do not say this to diminish her. I say it because she was a person, not a symbol, and she deserved to be accounted for precisely. The funeral was on a Friday, rain on the chapel roof, my father's black coat, too big across the shoulders, flowers I had ordered on the phone from Indianapolis. Robbie was there. I had known he would be. He was family now, technically Megan's husband, which was the kind of irony that stops being ironic when you have lived inside it long enough. Toby was also there. They were in the same room for approximately 45 minutes. What I noticed, watching from across the reception, was that Toby did not register Robbie as significant. He spoke to my aunts, helped my father find his coat, stood beside me with his hand at my lower back, and looked at the people I pointed out when I pointed them out. Robbie, across the room, kept glancing at Toby in a way that I recognized, the look of a man trying to perform indifference and failing the performance. A woman from my mother's church who knew the whole story leaned over to me at one point and said, quietly, "Your husband seems lovely," in a voice that carried a secondary meaning I let pass. My father had a small episode during the service, not a heart attack, the paramedics later confirmed, a vasovagal response, which is the body's way of opting out. He was helped to a chair in the side hall. He was embarrassed. I sat with him for 20 minutes while the service continued without us, and he held my hand with both of his in the mirror of something my mother had done years earlier, and we did not speak. Megan found me after, in the kitchen of our childhood home, while the reception dispersed through the front rooms. She looked like someone who had been preparing a speech and had lost confidence in it. She told me the marriage was controlling. She said financially, and then she said isolated, and then she stopped using qualifying words and just said, "I need to leave him. I'm planning to leave." She looked at me with an expression that was partly shame and partly, I thought, the residue of an old habit, the habit of coming to me when things went wrong, before she decided I was a person things could be done to rather than a person they were done with. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about my mother. I thought about the parking garage and the shower and the 11 boxes. I thought about Toby outside a restaurant bathroom with a bottle of water. I said, "Then leave him." She said, "Lauren." I said, "I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear. I don't have it to give. If you're leaving, leave. But you're asking the wrong person to hold your hand through it." I walked out of the kitchen. I did not look back to see her face, because I had decided, somewhere in the previous 4 years, that her face was no longer information I needed. I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks after the funeral, in September, in the bathroom of our house in Indianapolis, on my knees on the tile floor with the test in my hands. The line was unambiguous. I sat there for a long time. Then I laughed, which surprised me, and the laugh became something else, and then became a laugh again, and I sat there on the bathroom floor making undignified sounds that the house was polite enough to contain until Toby knocked on the door and asked, very carefully, if I was all right. I opened the door. I handed him the test. He sat down on the floor beside me, which is where we spent the next hour, on the bathroom tile, talking about things that were frightening and things that were not. And the late afternoon light came through the small window above the shower and lay across the floor in a stripe that moved slowly toward us. My sister's divorce was finalized the following spring. I heard from my father, who heard from my aunt, who had heard from Megan. The house was gone. The social circle had distributed itself as social circles do when a marriage ends publicly, some to him, some to her, most simply away. She had a small apartment. I was feeding Theo when my father called to tell me. Sitting in the rocking chair in the sage green room with Theo's weight in my arms, and the particular gravity of a sleeping infant, which is a weight unlike any other weight. I said, okay. My father said, she's not doing well. I said, I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I don't expect you to, and stopped. I know, Dad, I said. After I hung up, I sat there for a while longer in the green room with Theo sleeping against my chest. I thought about Megan in a small apartment. I thought about Robbie, who was not a monster, just a man who had chosen badly twice. I thought about what my mother might have wanted me to feel. What I actually felt was nothing in particular. Not triumph. Triumph requires an opponent, and I had stopped thinking of my sister as an opponent somewhere around the time I stopped thinking of her as a sister. Not grief, not exactly, though grief had been part of the earlier years. What I felt was the particular blankness of a door that has been closed long enough that you no longer reach for the handle. I had said what was true to her in that kitchen. Good. She wanted him that badly. Now she knows what he's worth. I had said it to my father on the phone without raising my voice, without performance. Tonight the house smells like paint that has become walls. Toby is beside me with his unread book. Theo is asleep in the green room. Outside, the October trees are doing what October trees do, which is turn colors that seem excessive until they become the only colors you can imagine, and then drop. I built this. Not in the sense of construction. The house existed before we found it. The city existed before I drove to it. The job posting appeared on its own. But I made the choices. The 11 boxes, the apartment on the north side, the coffee twice and then dinner, and then a parking lot outside a closed hardware store. I did not perform my way here. I did not manage evidence to arrive at an outcome that felt acceptable. I followed what was true. That is not a lesson. I am not offering it as one. It is simply what happened, and what happened became this. A Tuesday in October, a sage green room, a man asleep beside me, the irreversible specific weight of a life that no one is going to take.